and I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's first speaker, Rueanna Haynes. Rueanna Haynes is an experienced international climate law and governance specialist for the organization Climate Analytics, a global climate science and policy institute. Ms. Hayes is the acting head of diplomacy and director of Climate Analytics Caribbean and the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. She has a strong background in climate and other multilateral environmental negotiations, having participated in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for several years on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago. She has also been a lead negotiator for the Caribbean Community, Alliance of Small Island States, and G77 and China in the climate and sustainable development fields. In addition, she has significant experience in international negotiation processes. Rueanna holds 2 master's degrees, one in international legal studies from Georgetown University Law Center, and a second in international environmental policy from Sciences Po in Paris. Yeah. Welcome, Rueanna.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the introduction. And hello, everybody. Good evening. It's a definite pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I hope that we can have a great conversation. My presentation isn't too long. I'm also looking forward to Jackie's presentation afterwards and answer any questions that you all might have. So I think Dr. Farah is doing the slides for me, so you can start with the first slide, please. So just by way of background, well, you would have heard my extensive CV as read out by Laura. Fun fact about me, I do in fact hug trees. I find it to be a very, very lovely exercise. I know that we denigrate the idea sometimes of environmentalists as tree huggers, but I find it to be extremely calming and it's a lot of fun, and I do it at every opportunity. In terms of my area of specialty, climate law and governance, I like to tell young people that, well, first of all, I made that title up generally. There really wasn't a name for what I wanted to do or how I wanted to express what I wanted to do. My background in terms of study is, coming through the arts and humanities into law. But then most of my work experience has been in diplomacy. And although we might think sometimes that there's a high overlap between international law and international diplomacy, they're actually 2 quite separate fields. And for a long time, I found myself kind of in the middle of both, not really being sure about whether I wanted to be a diplomat or a lawyer. And so that's why I have 2 masters. I decided to do a master's in each area, innocently thinking that at the end of that, I would know for sure. I still didn't know. So when it came to describing my area of specialty, I kind of put together the things that I enjoy the most and that I think I'm actually knowledgeable about, which would be in the realm of climate law and governance in the context of the global climate regime that's set up under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. So hence the terminology, climate law and governance specialist. And I'm giving you this little anecdote to give you hope that you don't have to fit into anybody's boxes about your field of study and then what it means for what you will do or what title you'll carry later on. Feel free to make that stuff up. It's really quite okay. Next slide, please. So this is actually a photo of me at my high school graduation with one of my best friends a very, very long time ago. won't tell you how many years exactly, but I think for those of you who can see, it's actually on the photo itself. So I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm from not even the capital, the second city in San Fernando in Trinidad and Tobago. And my current role, as I said, it's in the area of climate law and governance. I work specifically a lot on climate policy at the international level and the design of international climate policy. Um, and that means I work in a space where there is a lot of law happening, but it's essentially a political forum because the diplomatic space is a political one, even though it's a political space where we're in fact making law and making policy in the form of treaties and other international agreements. Another fun fact about me, Carnival is my favorite festival. We have Carnival every year here in Trinidad and Tobago. Um, and we call it, well, for us, it's the greatest show on earth. So just a little plug. It's coming up again this year, in March. Next slide, please. And so tonight I wanted to talk a bit about really the role of climate science as a necessary driver of climate justice. And before we get into that more directly, I want to highlight some of the interlinkages that exist between climate change itself and social justice issues. So we know that climate change, or it's frequently described as an environmental issue, and it's kind of pigeonholed into being strictly about the environment, but actually it's not. It's very much broader than that. It touches on every aspect of human existence as we know it. So many of you would be aware of the wildfires that are happening now. In the US, in the West Coast, in LA. And the understanding is that the extent and the ferocity of these wildfires is being or has been as a result of the impacts of climate change that we are all already feeling. It's linked to the extreme heat that we've been experiencing globally as a result of the increase in average global temperatures. From looking at the baseline of pre-industrial times to now. We also know that as a result of climate change, we have a larger concentration of what we call greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which lead to health impacts, right? They lead to health impacts because of the quality of the air that we're breathing, and the fact that the more greenhouse gases we pump into the air, the less healthy that air is, which has implications for healthcare and who has access to healthcare. There are also racial justice implications when you look at where the most vulnerable people are and who the most vulnerable people are and why those people are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which often have racial implications from country to country, within countries, as well as if you look globally at the international level. So countries like mine, for example, small island developing states, which, are, or most of them have been previous colonies of various colonial powers, are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And a part of the story about that vulnerability has to do with historically the slave trade, colonization that have exposed countries like mine to the impacts of climate change, and have resulted in circumstances that make us extraordinarily vulnerable. And then we also have issues of women's rights that are linked into this when we think about, in particular, in for example, traditional societies where women generally have, more responsibility to go out and find water, for example, for activities within the household, and the fact that the worsening impacts of climate change are making their traditional rules increasingly difficult. Or when we think about, for example, extreme weather events that are caused or exacerbated by climate change, like cyclones and hurricanes, and you think about shelter situations and the safety of women in these shelters, you have a number of different types of women's rights that come up when we talk about climate change and its impacts. So just to illustrate that this issue is much bigger than just an environmental one. Next slide, please. So in my current role, I work at the intersection of science and policy. My work focuses on using scientific findings to help people and governments of the smallest and most marginalized or vulnerable countries to address the climate crisis. And in my work, we use climate science as a tool for supporting climate justice outcomes. The photo on the left there is it from last year or the year before? One of the conferences of the parties, a silent protest by civil society actors asking for a global goal on adaptation framework now. Adaptation is a key issue in the climate discussions. And so climate science, climate science and the findings and the research that are done by researchers and those involved, whether they're working with the physical sciences or otherwise, are really important and have been really important for helping us to understand what this phenomenon is, because we can observe that we are all seeing changes in various weather patterns, for example, even within the scope of our own lifetimes. But piecing it all together to understand, how this is really going to impact us is a huge, huge, huge task that really relies on a number of different disciplines within the scientific realm in the first instance. Some of them still at a nascent stage, but it is a very large undertaking to try to understand what is happening, to try to project all of the risks that are involved, and then to try to craft solutions. Next slide, please. So what is the relationship between research and justice? Data is extraordinarily important. If we don't have the data, then we cannot understand what's happening. We can't measure, we can't compare, we can't project. And in particular, when it comes to very small countries, because most of the data that we've had historically on climate change, especially on looking at, the risks and trying to project what the impacts are going to be, most of this data traditionally has been produced at the global scale. And so it speaks to, very large scale trends, and it speaks to impacts across large areas of landmass. Literally, it comes down to that. There's more data if the space that they're looking at is actually larger. So when it comes to countries like mine that are hardly even a speck on the map, data becomes less and less accurate, more and more scarce. And this really hampers decision making. It really doesn't allow us to fully understand what it is we are experiencing. And when you look at the fact that exactly where we don't have a lot of data, we know that there will be very extreme impacts. It really becomes a question of justice. And data is also linked to the ability of many countries to even be able to access climate financing in order to be able to deal with or cope with some of the impacts of climate change. And that photo on the right is a photo of me and most of the members of my team. Next slide, please. So how does climate science support climate justice? And I'm proposing sort of 5 big buckets around research and findings that look at climate impacts and the losses and damages that happen as a result of climate change, the development of policy-based proposals to address some of those findings, so to respond to what the data is showing, the development of advocacy and messaging and arguments crafted to influence international discussions, crafted to influence the political debate. Because if your arguments aren't based in fact, they have a much less chance of being successful or being influential. Legal arguments crafted to support claims for compensation or to stop harmful activities. And then finally, the potential for these findings to support court rulings or new political agreements that are reflecting these scientific findings. So the climate science is really a key enabler for climate justice, especially when we think about those who've been historically marginalized and who are the most vulnerable to climate impacts. There's a very broad ecosystem of professional careers in that field that require an understanding of scientific methods, but there's still a lot more work to be done to promote research and data from underrepresented peoples, countries, and regions. Because as I've said, if there's no data, then advocacy, policymaking, and beneficial outcomes become almost impossible to achieve. Next slide, please. Okay. And I think this is my last slide. So the chart that you see on the screen is taken directly from a report, a scientific report from an entity called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The citation is below. It's from their summary for policymakers. So we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a body made up of scientists that volunteer their time. So hundreds of scientists from all over the world that volunteer their time to basically synthesize the findings from all of the research that is constantly happening about the climate crisis. How is it caused? You know, how is it projected to impact us? How is it already impacting us? What are some of the solutions? They work on all of those questions, on all of those issues, and they produce a major report every 7 years. So right now in the cycle of the IPCC, we've just had the 6th assessment report, and this figure on your left is taken from that report. And what this figure is showing is the extent to which current and future generations will experience a hotter and different world. And it's highlighting that, you know, there is some variability in terms of how much of a hotter world present and future generations will experience, but it all depends on the decisions that we take now and the decisions that we take in the near term. I like this graph because what it illustrates very starkly is that at this point in time, every single human being alive on the planet is experiencing the impacts of climate change. At this point in time, everyone alive is already experiencing it. And so everyone who is already born and many who have yet to be born will be experiencing increasingly the impacts of climate change, and the severity of those impacts varies depending on what we do within this decade. So essentially, we have a very tiny window out until 2030 to turn things around. And right now, it's not looking like that is going to happen, but we remain optimistic. Anything at all is always possible in this world. So they've set out a few scenarios here where we have very low warming, intermediate amount of warming, high warming, and very high warming. And if you look at it, even in the scenario of the very low warming, even in the scenario of the very low warming, we will all continue to experience a vastly hotter and different world. So there is a lot that still needs to be done. And usually I get the question, so then what can I do as an individual? This topic is so big, it's so vast, it's so large, it seems so much outside of the scope of what one person can do. And I usually recommend three big buckets: education, advocacy, and some reflection on personal choices and how they impact what will happen in our worlds. In the context of education, we cannot have a problem that we do not understand. The first thing is that we need to understand what's happening. And that is, whether or not you choose to go into it from a scientific point of view, or you choose to take a different approach. I believe there's a role for everyone, and that includes, the artists, the poets, the musicians. We all have a role to play, and we all need to understand what's going on so that we can then play the role that we need to play. There's obviously also a need for advocacy because it's the big system changes that are needed in order to slow down and stop this crisis. And that means decisions by governments. And so we know that governments need to be encouraged most of the time to do the right thing, to get out of the inertia, to stop selling out to private interests. And so advocacy is always going to be needed, organizing and pushing. And then personal choices. So even though we cannot, as individuals, solve this crisis on our own, any one of us, personal choices do matter. The extent to which, your diet is full of meat as opposed to being more varied, it does matter because of the greenhouse gas emissions from some animals that we tend to enjoy eating, like cows, for example. And so personal choices do matter, but they also matter in the context of, a holistic understanding that we all have a role to play, and there are many different ways in which we can play that role. So I'll end there. I think I saw there was one question in the chat. I'll hand back over to Dr. Farah. I don't know if we're going to take questions now, or if we take questions at the end.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll have a section dedicated to Q&A after the second speaker. So this is another reminder to everybody in the Zoom room. Please put your questions in the chat, and then we will ask you to unmute and ask your question during the Q&A. Thank you very much, Rueanna. I'll pass it on to our next ambassador to introduce our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. So our next speaker is going to be Jaqueline Patterson. Jaqueline Patterson is a founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. The mission of the Chisholm Legacy Project is rooted in the Just Transition framework, serving as a vehicle to connect Black communities on the front lines of climate justice with the resources to actualize visions. Prior to the launch of the Chisholm Legacy Project, Patterson served as the Senior Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program for over a decade. During her tenure, she founded and implemented a robust portfolio, which included serving the state and local leadership whose constituencies consisted of hundreds of communities of the front lines of environmental injustice. She led a team in designing and implementing a portfolio to support political education and organizing work executed by the NAACP branches, chapters, and state conferences. Patterson has dedicated her career to intersectional approaches to systems change. Working with frontline communities from Kampala, Uganda, to Kansas City, United States, to Kingston, Jamaica, her passion for social justice led her to serve as a coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United, senior women's rights and policy analyst for Action Aid, assistant vice president for HIV/AIDS programs for IMA World Health, outreach project associate for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, research coordinator for Johns Hopkins University, and United States Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica. Patterson holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. In addition to running her own organization, she serves on numerous boards. In March 2024, Patterson was honored to be named on one of Time's Magazine Women of the Year, as well as receive the Time Magazine Earth Award. We would like to welcome Jackie.
Thank you. Oops. Okay, good. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to having this few minutes of conversation with you. Yeah, so we'll get started. I want to, we have a set of principles that we in the kind of organizing community go by called the Haynes principles. And one of the Haynes principles is let the people speak for themselves. So I always feature when I'm talking both kind of a bit of storytelling of my own, but also having people be able to tell their own stories. And so the first thing that I think we'll see is a video, well, not a video, but a song. And we'll see some of the people who are singing it through these slides. And this is a song that won second place in this.
We need to take control. We need to take control. We need to take control of this climate. We need to take control. We need to take control. We need to take control of this climate. We need to take control. We need to take control. We need to take control of this climate. It's getting hot. Yeah, it's heating up. The climate changing, how it's affecting us. You mean the floods, storms, droughts, and fires, and heat-related deaths in the U.S. is getting higher, huh? Now who at risk? You at risk, so what you doing? Neighborhoods affected by all this air pollution, and it's amusing, it's a problem, it's solution. Decrease your carbon footprint, it's really not hard to do. I've been going green since a little kid. In my hood, the heat is killing kids. I speak for the climate, yeah. I'm the Earth's ventriloquist. Those heat waves, I know you feeling it. Stop burning that coal. Use propane when you grilling it, cause it can harm your respiratory. Ask these politicians for change, they ain't doing nothing for me. They pollute around my area, cause we ain't in the category. We need to take control of this climate, ladder to prosperity. I'm ready to climb it. This country's morals lost. Somebody help me find it. Our eco-death certificate, they ready to sign it. And I ain't having that, especially not around my habitat. And that's mainly where it happened at. They acting upon us, so that's the reason why we acting back. Protesting, lobbying, going green is my hobby, man. Stop drilling for fossils, worry about tomorrow. Keep going at this rate, the whole earth gon' be in sorrow. No resources to borrow. I said let's take control of our climate and your carbon footprint. Please try to decline it. It's getting hot, yeah, it's heating up. The climate changing.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so out of the mouths of babes, they are, I mean, as you see, they really are, they really are telling pretty much that's the entire presentation in a nutshell. I mean, they are explaining climate science in the most compelling way imaginable. They're also talking about the solutions. They're talking about the systemic underpinnings of where we are. I mean, they really know what they're talking about. They say the people closest to the problems are best positions to design the solutions, and they are definitely a testament to that. So just giving a little bit of kind of some of these very systemic underpinnings that we're talking about and some of the impacts that we see on the front lines of climate change. I'll just talk through a little bit of that, and then we'll do another video clip, more wisdom being sprouted by the youth out there who are leading on this work. So as we know, as really Rueanna has already shared with us, we know the historical context of where we are. starting from the history of this nation, you know, contrary to the romanticized notions of kind of explorers happening upon the land and so forth. We know that there was from the very beginning this capitalist intention, the greed that was really the intention, and we know who paid the price in terms of the people who were displaced from the land. We know that the land continues to pay the price in terms of the ways that we extract from the land. And we know that who was extracted from our original lands in terms of Black folks being brought over in the hulls of ships to become the enslaved labor that built the infrastructure for this country. So that's, you know, all the historic context, and we know how all of this has been institutionalized in our trade policies, our finance policies, our labor laws or lack thereof, a lack of environmental laws, and so forth and so on. So next slide. And we see how that's playing out, whether it's the coal-fired power plants, or next slide, the oil and gas refineries, next slide. All of this is combining to harm the human and civil rights of people who are surrounding these facilities, whether it's the coal miners, 68,000 of which have died of Black lung disease, while the very companies that are supposed to be protecting their workers have fought against the laws that would have protected them from coal mine dust, at least to some extent. We have the communities that are more likely to live next to these smokestacks, including in the lower left-hand corner, the Cesar Chavez High School, which is right on top of this oil refinery, which is one of 10 oil refineries within a 5-mile radius of that school. We know that African Americans, 71% of African Americans live in counties in violation of air pollution standards. So we're right at the feet of the very facilities that are driving the climate catastrophes that we're seeing every day, all day. But in our communities, we're having these mini catastrophes every day, and the death of 1,000 cuts from the particulate matter, the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen oxide, the benzene that's being emitted into our communities. Next slide. And so just a picture of the same, next slide. And so we see how it plays out in terms of the health conditions, whether it's the fact that African-American children are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter the hospital from an asthma attack than white American children, and are 2 to 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack. Next slide. And this is just the medicines of a young boy whose name is Antoine, and his parents showed me this kind of picture of the medicines that he needs to be able to breathe every day. They talk about having to miss days of work because they have to take him to the emergency room on poor air quality days. Next slide. And we see how this is a picture of Antoine and his grandparents. And they sent me this picture because they thought it was kind of emblematic of his life in terms of him often looking on while other children are playing, because his lung capacity doesn't allow him to play like other children are able to play. And they really thought that this picture is worth 1,000 words. Next slide. And we know that if you're living next to a toxic facility, then that the property values in your community tend to be lower, and property values are what resources our school. So we have kids who are unable to pay attention in school because manganese and other lead and so forth that impact our attention are coming out of these smokestacks. The schools are less resourced because of the property values being lower on average. Next slide. And so if you're not in school because of asthma that's keeping you out of school and poor air quality days, you're in school and barely able to pay attention, your school doesn't have enough of a high quality, then it certainly challenges your ability to be on grade level by the 3rd grade, which people are directly tying to the school to prison industrial complex pipeline. Next slide. So then that's on kind of the driver side of the climate continuum in terms of the impacts of pollution in our communities. Then we're talking about the impacts of climate change, which we're seeing all too well. Next slide. And so whether it's the disasters that we see or the shifts in agricultural yields, already our communities are more likely to be able to get taquitos or Doritos or Cheetos than quinoa or kiwi or kale. And so when you're getting food out of a corner store that looks like this, then the foods are heavy in preservatives and salts in sugars, all the things that are literally, these are, again, highly processed foods, the very thing that's become the headlines these days. And I think Rueanna already talked about diet issues as it relates to the diet that drives climate change in terms of confined animal feeding operations and so forth. But then there's also the impacts of shifts in agricultural yields, where we already were food insecure because of redlining and so forth, and now even more food insecure because of shifts in agricultural yields resulting from climate change. Next slide. And then when we talk about sea level rise, we know that there are already communities in Louisiana, the Ile-de-Jean Charles Band, the Biloxi, Chickamauga, Choctaw has already been displaced from their lands. And that's only the beginning. Places like Norfolk and all these other places are, oops, go back again, sorry. They are already being displaced, such that in the upper right-hand corner, that's a picture of, they did a cabinet meeting in the Maldives. They did it underwater to demonstrate where they're going to be in less than 20 years from sea level rise displacement. Next slide. And so all of this, like these direct impacts of climate change, are also intersectional with these other issues that we have in our communities. There's a, we talked about this phenomenon of living while Black. So whether it's a Yale student who had police called on her after she fell asleep in the common room, the people who are just meeting in the Starbucks who had the police called on them, or the person who was just checking out of an Airbnb and was swarmed by the police as a result. Next slide. And then when we're in the context of climate catastrophes, and after Hurricane Katrina, this was a now famous set of images from the Associated Press, where on the left side, where two different people are doing the same activity. These two white folks, they said 2 residents wade through chest-deep floodwaters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. But when it was a Black American child, it's a young man wades through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. So they're literally doing the exact same activity, but the white folks are just trying to find things to survive. But the Black kid is like looting. So next slide. And this is what leads to things like, it leads to criminalization, and what leads to what happened on the Danziger Bridge, where the family members were literally shot there when they were just going back into town to try to find their relatives. Next slide. And of course, the result of racial profiling plus criminalization can actually be an instant death sentence. And we know all the stories that tell the same story. I mean, all the examples of the same story. Next slide. So this is why the call for Black lives to matter, because too many seem to find our lives to be disposable, or they, in the words of Trevor Noah, we seem to be characterized as being born a crime, as he said in his biography. Next slide. So then when we talk about other intersections, Rueanna gave us a bit of a sense of the global picture, places where climate change is particularly a hot spot, where women have to go and find and be the ones who are fetching water. This is impacting people's lives, in particular in terms of gendered impacts. Next slide. And there's also these kind of resource wars that are happening, and unfortunately, women are used as weapons of war in these different places. Next slide. Next slide. And in the United States also, where these man camps and predator economies are coming up, then it's indigenous women who are paying the price by being just existing, living in these places where these predator economies are impacting through trafficking and otherwise. Next slide. And so there's too many examples of the sexual assault that's happening along the pipeline, missing and murdered indigenous women and so forth. Next slide. And also in terms of climate forced migration in the Central America, when people are coming across the border, next slide, they're coming across the border more often than not because of desperation, whether their lands have been decimated by disaster or they're not producing crops anymore. And yet when people come over, they're treated as, next slide, people to be incarcerated, whether it's children or families or otherwise. Next slide. And this is a quote from Warshan Shire, a Kenyan-born Somali poet, who said, "You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." Next slide. There's another video I would have shown you, but we're running a little bit short on time, so I'll keep going through. Next slide. So I just want to give a sense of some of the youth-led climate justice work that's going on out there. This is a woman, a young lady who's in Hawaii, Kristen Brown. She did a whole video interviewing the community members in Hawaii about their relationship with the ocean and the way that their relationship with the ocean is being threatened by sea level rise, where the ocean is actually overtaking their community. Next slide. And this is a group that went to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties, the very kind of pivotal one. And so this group of youth were really leading on the US climate voices there. Next slide. And they actually did a sit-in. They really talked about this in the context of Black Lives Matter when they were talking about the impacts of climate change. Next slide. And this is the same group speaking at one of the side events that we organized. Next slide. And also speaking at another side event. Next slide. And another group of youth actually went, it was Indigenous and Black youth, and we took this delegation to Iceland. They had these $295 round trip introductory fares that we took advantage of. And these youth went to Iceland. The youth were from places like Hawaii, Louisiana, all coastal communities that were being impacted by sea level rise. So they went and visited the very ice caps whose water end up literally in their backyard because of sea level rise, and to really explore and talk about the relationship with water. Next slide. And this is some images from that trip. Next slide. And this is actually a campaign where youth in Boston won access to a youth pass for public transportation due to a pretty great narrative strategy that they used to win that campaign. Next slide. Yeah, and this is Uprose, where again, youth organizing is winning all kinds of victories in New York and in Brooklyn. Next slide. And this is the Youth Citizen Science Project, where youth were actually testing their own water, testing their own soil, and testing their air, and then using those findings to push for justice for their community, which they were able to achieve, working with the local municipality. Next slide. And this is a case where, again, the youth prevailed in the Our Children's Trust Juliana versus the United States of America. And they really pushed against the US's actions that are threatening the future of the youth. Next slide. And yeah, more of the same. Next slide. So I saw how we had to, and these are the 21 plaintiffs in that same case that again won through youth leadership. Next slide. And the defendants that were explicitly listed in that case. Next slide. And this is just some of the evidence that they put forward. Again, the youth were really using the very same data that Rueanna said was so necessary for us to win. Next slide. And just some of the other activities, youth-led activities in terms of green schools to make because we know that buildings are one of the biggest things that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. And so this is another video I would have loved to show you, but maybe during that longer time, we can do that week after next. But next slide. Underestimate how long it takes us to keep saying next slide like that. Whereas if it was me, I'd just be clicking through at the speed of light. So I wanted to just end with some of the actual softer things that we do that are just as critical. Policy change and projects and so forth are important, but social cohesion is also critical, both in terms of organizing, and also in terms of adaptation and resilience building for the climate future that we're already facing now. Next slide. So, making sure that we do have good decision-making processes as we design projects and so forth is critical. Next slide. Making sure that we center well-being, that we center gender justice, that we center mental health in the work that we do. Next slide. And that we are healing from past challenges. I mean, all of the history that we talked about at the very beginning, it's important that we have restorative healing justice as part of what we do. Next slide. And so just to show a few roles in climate justice leadership, next slide. From being a researcher to an activist to an organizer to a trainer to a policy analyst, all of these are critical to the pathways to environmental and climate justice. And all of this is part of certainly my work. It might have one job title, but it involves multiple roles. Next slide. So like I said, we're going to just click right through these. Researcher, next slide. Policy analyst, like the mercury in air toxics rule, making that better. Next slide. Advocate, making sure that we're on the front lines of telling the story of what needs to be done. Next slide. Trainer, political education, making sure folks know. Next slide. Organizer, as people get that political education, helping people to build power and push for change. Next slide. And activist, making sure to speak truth to power. A quote from Audre Lorde, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." Next slide. And I really want to, oh, I forgot about this. So anyway, so go through the next slide. So some of the key aspects of leadership is having a vision. So many of our dreams seem impossible, then improbable, then inevitable. Next slide. Listening and sensitivity. It's only through listening that you learn, and I never want to stop learning. Drew Barrymore. Next slide. Speaking truth to power, one of the truest tests of integrity is its blunt refusal to be compromised. Chinua Achebe. Next slide. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Thank goodness I memorized that since we got past that pretty quickly. Mahatma Gandhi. And then humility, be able to laugh at yourself. And I was visiting a community, someone was talking about something in the community, and I was like, can we go back to the part when you said that there are bears around here? But anyway, next slide. And so as we talk about telling our own stories and leading our own destinies, I want to end with a humorous anecdote. Next slide. From, oh yeah, okay, yeah. Well, first, this is a quoted African proverb: "Until lions write their own history, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And this is illustrated through this Saturday Night Live skit where they do this weekend update. And next slide. So this story that they were telling in the weekend update was, as headlined in the local newspaper, hunter thinking deer was dead was injured as a deer jumped up and gored him. Next slide. Or as was told in the local newspaper, next slide, serial killer injured as victim fights back. So next slide, it is truly all about perspective and the power of the voices of the people on the front lines. So next slide, this is a poem I would have shown you if we had more time, but definitely we'll maybe check that out during our Tuesday session together. So thank you so much. Appreciate you all.
That was incredible. Super duper fast. Well done, Jackie.
Thank you.
So we will transition pretty quickly to the Q&A. Thank you very much, both of our speakers, Jackie and Rueanna. Photos, the experiences you've shared speak much louder than words can say, and I'm sure everybody's really appreciative of what you brought to the table today. Now we're ready for our Q&A. We'll start with the questions in the chat. We'll see how much time we have for more questions afterwards, but I'll pass it on to Laura. Please take it away.
Thank you, Hassan. Okay, so my question is for Rueanna. What is a project or undertaking that you're most proud of or enjoyed regarding climate law or diplomacy?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that question and I still don't have a clear answer, but let me venture. So what's coming to mind is between, I would say, 2011 to 2015. I was working on in the context of the negotiations that produced the Paris Agreement. And we were having a discussion on the long-term temperature goal that's set out in the Paris Agreement. So I think now if you ask people what the long-term temperature goal is, if they even understand what that means, and if they've heard of it, they might tell you 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's in the news. It's in the news that we've breached it. It's in the news, what do we do now? It's in the news around that question of 1.5. But when I started in the process, and certainly coming out of, previous COPs, the goal that was spoken about was a 2-degree goal. And at the time, countries that I represent and work with, so small island developing states, were very skeptical about that goal, but didn't have the necessary data to prove definitively that that goal, that 2-degree goal, was dangerous. It was too high. It would be catastrophic for the lives and the livelihoods of people in small island developing states and people otherwise on the front lines of the climate crisis. Essentially, when small island developing states proposed a 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, they were laughed out of the room. So you had government representatives saying that will never happen. Nobody cares. 1.5 C will mean that their industries will die. It will mean that their economies will become, less profitable. It would hurt their bottom lines. And so, no. And this was the response over and over again. Let's say that advocacy started in 2008. This was the response 2008, 2009 in Copenhagen, except that what we were able to achieve was an agreement that we would have a review of the 2-degree goal. So we'd agree, okay, let's agree it's 2 degrees, but we will review this goal. So from about 2011, I would say, or no, maybe 2011 till about 2015, I was the negotiator for small island developing states in those discussions to review that goal. And in those discussions, I primarily worked with scientists who spent a lot of their time trying to ensure that, they were able to source research, do research, write papers, draw out conclusions from different papers that already existed to help to support the position of small island developing states that no, that 2-degree goal is too high. And, after several years of that discussion, we were able to do just that. There was a final report that essentially said that even though there isn't a lot of data to support how we would actually be able to stay within a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, it is the limit that will guarantee the survival and viability of threatened ecosystems and of small island developing states. It is when you look at the impacts and the difference in impacts of 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels as opposed to 1.5 degrees Celsius, when you look at that difference in impacts, it justifies a shift to a 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And because of that discussion, and because of that, the outcome of that discussion, we were negotiating the Paris Agreement at the same time. When it came down to an agreement on what the long-term temperature goal will be in the Paris Agreement, we were able to secure language that, although it still referenced a 2-degree goal, it also says and also commits countries to implement measures aligned with a 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And, over time, there's been more research done. A special report was done by the IPCC on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And now it's generally accepted that the long-term temperature goal we're working with is 1.5 degrees Celsius, even though that acceptance has almost come at a time when we've made it almost impossible to still stay within that limit. It's still important because one of the other things that we learned during the review process was that every additional fraction of a degree of warming matters. Every additional fraction of a degree of warming will make a very real difference to the impacts that people see and feel of the climate crisis. And so there's still very much great value in moving towards and pushing towards that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. So I guess that's what comes to mind in terms of one of the more significant things that I would have done throughout my career.
Thank you so much. I think that kind of is a testament to persistence, right? So many years, and finally a fraction moved down. But I guess we can go next to Araceli's question. And then afterwards, we do have announcements for both mentees and mentors. So remember to stick on this call.
I'll try and keep this as short as I can. A little bit of context. I live in a rural community where there's this notion that I see in like everyone in my surroundings that like so many things are going down, nothing that we can do can change anything. And I see this in like the retirees that live in my neighborhood. I see this in my peers, my classmates, and I even hear my parents talking about it, and they're like, "Oh, I saw this this progressive movement downtown, and I don't think it's going to do anything." And I'm like, "Well, I don't really know how to navigate through that because we have the evidences, we have the data, the history. We are optimistic that there is a change, that we have a chance to create change. But how do we keep other people optimistic? There is probably like a simple answer to this question, but I do want to ask that. Thank you.
And to be mindful of time, we'll have Jackie answer this question, and then we will do the closing right afterwards.
Yes, I'll be super brief. Yeah, I mean, I think that the best way is to, as they say, show, don't tell, like to really demonstrate the places where people are taking action and it's actually making an appreciable change, and to be able to elevate those types of situations. And I think also one of the things we've really done a disservice to deeply rural communities, because so much of the megaphone and the microphone is being held by the urban communities. And so a lot of our work is in deeply rural communities because of that dynamic, and wanting to make sure that people do see that, and actually helping to elevate the stories of other rural communities to rural communities. So that it's not like, well, yeah, that happened there, but that's never going to happen here. Like that's not going to work here. So we really want to be able to show like communities to be able to inspire action. So for us, it's been all about like getting someone to be the spark, and then helping to amplify that spark. Because otherwise it's hard to just convince somebody, just unless you show people what's possible. So that's our strategy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions and like communicating in the chat. We're going to pass it over to Ebony to close us out for a community talk.
So thank you so much. This has been an incredibly important talk, and we are very grateful to Rueanna Haynes and Jackie Patterson for spending this evening with us. And to our audience, you can extend your appreciation to our speakers in the chat. Mentees and mentors, don't forget to log off. We have a few minutes dedicated to you to ask any questions, and don't forget to complete the attendance form. And thank you all for attending this community talk. Please visit our website, ourfuturescience.org, and follow us on social media to learn about our initiative and future events and our educational campaign. And thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk today, very informative.
Thank you.
And then thank you, speakers. We will be starting the announcements very soon, everybody. So stay put just for a couple minutes. It'll be over quickly, I promise.
I like that there are a number of cats that really wanted to be part of tonight's talk. In my screen, Angela and Mia's cats are right on top of each other. We will have to have one of these sessions where everyone brings their pets in.
Oh, that'd be fun. Little pet show and tell. So let's quickly go through. I know we're over time already, everybody. So for the first announcement, we have Capstone Checkpoint 1 due on Sunday. So for all the mentees, it's really, really important that you share that Capstone Checkpoint with your mentors as soon as possible. That way they can provide feedback before you submit it to OFIS. That way, when we're providing feedback, you're not getting feedback from us that's this long. You're already getting feedback from your mentors, and we can go on top of that. So that's the big thing there. Please check your work, read them aloud, make sure your work flows well and makes sense, and then proofread and proofread again. With the research question and hypothesis, some of you may be struggling with that process. That's okay, because next Thursday, a week from today, we'll have our professional development workshop on the scientific method and capstone development. So we'll have 2 ambassadors come in alongside some of our OFIS staff, and we'll let you guys know big pictures, small pictures, and different examples of how to make research questions that are testable, feasible, accessible, and hypotheses that could actually be tested as well. The next thing is capstone feedback sessions. So this is something that may be new for some of you, haven't heard of before. These are opportunities for mentees and mentors to meet with us directly, typically after these checkpoints. So what will happen is you'll submit your checkpoints to us this weekend. Caroline and I will take the next week and a half to review everybody's checkpoints and provide feedback. You will get that feedback, start tailoring and fixing your work, and then the feedback session is allowing us to have a discussion about that work. Then Capstone Checkpoint 2 is everything you've done already till now, except adding what your output would be. So it may seem intimidating what's coming up around the corner, but I promise you a lot of the work, most of the work that is necessary has already been done by you all. So we're in good standing. Other than that, I think we've gone through our announcements. One person from your mentorship team must pick a slot on Sign Up Genius, but everyone should register for that date. So for example, if all of us OFIS staff are on teams 12, one of us has to sign up on Sign Up Genius, but all of us have to register for Zoom. I hope that makes sense. That'll also be reiterated in the newsletter. And I think that's it for our announcements to you. If there are any questions that you have for us, we'll stay on just a little bit longer. Otherwise, we will see you all again next Thursday, and we'll be seeing the ambassadors on Tuesday.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank you, ambassador hosts. Great work.